If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. It was George Orwell who said that. And evidently, there is a great deal people don't want to hear. But more disturbing is the fervor and effort exerted to make sure the information that you do hear is sanctioned, edited, and crafted by those with the power to impose a cultural and scientific authority. Why? Only tyrants and thugs destroy books, ban discussion, disappear dissidents. Freedom has never been increased from the repression of opinion and the sharing of knowledge. Never. So does liberty really exist at all if we don't have medical liberty, control over one's own body? Whatever is happening, it is well executed because never before have highly awarded, published, renowned, reputable scientists, doctors, and other medical and scientific professionals with treatment ideas and concerns actually been censored, banned, ignored, threatened, and disparaged at such great rates. This includes previous forum speakers, including Drs. Bhattacharya and Atlas from Stanford, Drs. Tyson and Fareed, saving thousands of lives in the Central Valley, former state senator and now gubernatorial candidate in Minnesota, Dr. Scott Jensen of Minnesota, whose medical license is now being threatened by the state for the 4th time. It seems science has indeed separated itself from its own guidelines. I have a clear sense that Dr. Robert Malone did not have addressing the Liberty Forum of Silicon Valley on his professional radar. He has been very busy as an internationally recognized scientist focusing on virology, immunology, and molecular biology. The original pioneer of mRNA vaccination, DNA vaccination, and multiple non-viral DNA and RNA, mRNA delivery technologies. Dr. Malone holds fundamental and domestic foreign patents in the fields of gene delivery, delivery formulations, and vaccines, including for fundamental DNA and RNA, mRNA vaccine technologies. Licensed as a physician in Maryland, both Drs. Malone operate a consultant practice specializing in advanced development of medical countermeasures for infectious disease. Basically, he has dedicated his entire career to the development of safe vaccines. As a vaccinologist, he shouldn't need it, but he is a demonstrably courageous man. And in response to sharing his insights, he is both highly sought after as well as smeared and trolled. What happened to the productive tradition of scientific debate and discussion that we all assume is happening behind the scenes with our top medical and scientific minds? Strikingly, Dr. Malone's openness to discussion alone distinguishes him in his chaotic and tragic response to COVID. Dr. Malone has also exhibited enormous generosity as he makes himself available to a staggering amount of media inquiries and to us this evening. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Robert Malone.
I have to set my timer because I talk too much, in case any of you that listen to the podcast weren't aware of that. Thank you. Thank you. I didn't ask for this, in case you weren't aware of that. This is totally unexpected in my life. It came about through a series. Let's see. I'm seeing somebody in the back. Do we need more amp on the mic? Testing. 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 Good. Okay, cool. I'll try not to blow the mic out with your assistance. I didn't ask for this, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here. Now we're to
Just kick Closer to the mic.
Yeah.
Move your mic.
Well, the problem is I walk around a little bit. So thanks. I guess part of what led to this enables me is my primary client and customer, the people that I'm focused on are my customers and clients, and particularly my colleagues in the Department of Defense. That's my primary focus, is protecting the warfighter. And that's a group that values alternative opinions and values people speaking freely and sharing alternative perspectives. This is how we mitigate threats. I'm a specialist in threat mitigation, among other things. I've been through way too many pandemics. I cut my teeth on the very earliest days of AIDS in 1983 at UC Davis. And pandemics have kind of been my business for a long time. It's easy to get caught up in it. You get to be a kind of a pandemic junkie. But in this case, just reflecting on Jane's comments, why does this feel so okay to me to speak out and not self-censor? And I think a lot of it has to do with it just being my business. My clients value independent opinion. And so for me, it's just natural to be doing this. So I think that's part of it. I don't know, I'm grateful to be called courageous. For me, it's just kind of my business, and I solve complicated problems for the government and build teams to do that. That's what I do for a living. So running against the stream is kind of just in my DNA. So if we can tee up the first slide beyond this. And thank you. I really, in the face of all the trolls and everything else, and the character assassination that I have to deal with on a daily basis, the kind comments and their support from folks like you and the handwritten letters and things like that really make a difference to me. And it's like my armor. You know, I can walk through this life and this world and all these attacks, and I'm protected because I know that I have friends and colleagues and folks like you surrounding me that are supporting me, and that gives me the courage. In addition, of course, to my wife and majority shareholder of our shared business. I am a woman-owned small business and have been for many, many years. So we got to start off with the bona fides. Who is Robert Malone? And I suspect this audience, it isn't lost on you that a few of you have read Ayn Rand, and you may know what I'm referring to. John Galt, of course, and I feel sometimes like I'm channeling the Fountainhead. And I'm very aware that the end of that story ends up with John Galt being tortured by the bureaucrats. So I'm fully expecting it, but it's coming in little dribs and drabs. So this is the educational background. I am a California native, as is Jill. I was born in I'm told I should say Stanford, California now, since it's incorporated. I'm really a product, except for Northwestern and Harvard, of the University of California system, and I started off at Santa Barbara City College as a computer science student for 2 years, which is what taught me logic. So I'm very glad to be here in Silicon Valley. I always tell the story. I dropped being a computer science student because I was tired of sitting in a room with no windows staring at a computer monitor, and now I do the same thing, only I earn about a third less than I would have if I was So education, next slide. I'm not just a physician scientist. Before that, I was a farmer and a carpenter. That's true. And here's my bona fides for that. We raise Lusitano horses. This is about our 5th small farm that we've done. So this is kind of Galt's Gulch, frankly. We live on 50 acres in Virginia. We raise Lusitano horses. We had 7 foals this year. And in the bottom right, I was a foreman of the shingling crew as a young man when we built this interesting place in Mission Canyon in Santa Barbara. It's called the Whale House. I believe we have a successful practice. We're not wealthy people, but we pay our bills. Next slide. Both of our sons are computer scientists. Professional highlights. Much of what I do really is assembling teams to solve complicated problems for the government. And I'm quite good at it. I know the intricacies of the government, and our bureaucracy has become so large and cumbersome that it often has trouble talking to itself. And it really needs interlocutors like myself that understand where the system is broken, where the disconnects exist, to try to help move things forward. And that's a lot of what I do. As a consequence, I'm very familiar with the way the government works and with many of the key players in positions of power and control, often kind of second-tier people. I don't generally work with the people who are heads of institutes or directors. Yes, I know Tony Fauci and others, and Janet, and I deal with them from time to time, but usually I'm dealing with the next layer of bureaucrats. I've done many things. I've done multiple startups. I have many issued patents. Yes, I did originate this technology platform as a graduate student at the Salk Institute, and I have the scars to prove it. And you can find all the documents Jill's put up on our website at rwmalone.com. If you don't believe the story, just see for yourself all the patents, etc. I've been an academic for multiple years. I've been trained in business development formally for TASC, a large government contractor, program and project management, regulatory affairs, clinical research, bioethics, epidemiology, biostatistics, goes on and on and on. I know this stuff. This is my world. Outbreaks is kind of what I do. The picture from the lower right is from one of the first internal meetings for the development of the Ebola vaccine in Geneva at the World Health Organization. And I was key in bringing forth the Public Health Agency Canada vaccine candidate from New Link, and then getting Merck involved. And this was a DOE-funded project, by the way, even though we weren't allowed to get credit for it. But that's now called the Merck Ebola vaccine. So that's just one example of the kind of stuff I do. And most people haven't ever, even in the government, many or around that area, many people haven't heard of me. I have secret clearance, and I work quietly. That's what my client likes. So I've been brought out in this context because I thought it was important to speak. And my close colleagues do support what I'm doing. There's a lot of frustration within the government about what's going on and the communications that are coming out of government. And there's a lot of mothers and fathers and parents of young people, both children that are having to go to school and facing vaccination, and young adults that are having to go back to university, and they're just as upset as you are. They have the same feelings, and I get a lot of positive from those folks. Mr. Biden doesn't generally call me up. I did have a chat with Pelosi's office the other day that was interesting, but generally I don't work at that tier. We are currently focused in our team on drug repurposing, have been since the start of the outbreak, and this is on the QT, not official yet, but we may hear we understand we're going to hear from the FDA this Friday that we'll be given the allowance finally after 2 months of negotiation to proceed with our repurposed drugs, which is a combination of celecoxib and famotidine. So these are generic. One of them is over-the-counter, you call it Pepsid, and the other one is by prescription, and you call it Celebrex. Our data suggests that those are quite potent when administered early or even in hospitalized patients. So we'll see double-blind randomized clinical trials about to start, 3 of them, 1 in India and 2 in the States, an outpatient and inpatient. Hopefully those will start about mid-September. I've won over $2 billion in federal awards for my clients' lifetime. I kind of know how to put together big projects. I generally don't go after the small ones. I sit on the active committee, which is the NIH committee that is managing a lot of the drug clinical trials right now for NIH, so I'm very familiar with that, including Active 6, the ivermectin trial. Next slide. So I understand the government. Now the next thing that Jane wanted me to talk about was this question, and I always get this through the podcast. Some of you may know, since the Brett Weinstein Dark Horse podcast, I've kind of been called to duty to explain things, and folks often want to understand what are RNA vaccines and how does it work.
So this is a schematic from an American Chemical Society document, manuscript, review, lay press. These RNA vaccines are gene therapy. We really have our licensed products right now for vaccines are based on gene therapy technology. They're gene therapy technology applied to the vaccine indication. And I'll go through that in a couple minutes about how that came about. In the case of the RNA vaccines, these are not liposomes. You hear these words. And by the way, I don't know anything about the World Economic Forum and whether or not they're guiding all of this. And I don't know whether or not what the constituents are. And there's various rumors about certain elements that are in these products. And don't ask me about those because I don't know if they are in there. They're not disclosed. But the truth is the full nature of the formulations aren't disclosed. And so I don't know exactly what's in the final tube. And don't ask me about graphene. Okay. If there is graphene in there, then yes, graphene has been advocated as an agent that can be used with mRNA. That's true. There are multiple peer-reviewed papers about that. That's true. Is graphene oxide in these preparations, such as the Pfizer one? I suspect not, but I can't prove it. There's clauses in the Pfizer contract that make it so that it can't be tested by third parties. And since they don't disclose the formulation, we really can't insist on the FDA looking for whether or not these are actually constituents or whether they're adulterants. And that's the question that's really being raised, and that's the FDA's business to determine that. And I can't answer the question, Steve, sorry. What these are is self-assembling particles. They're not liposomes. So the way this works, and just to go through it, here's the, forgive any of you who are molecular biologists, you can put your hands over your ears right now and don't scream. The central dogma of biology is that DNA makes RNA and RNA makes protein. There's various kinds of RNAs. There's RNAs that, for instance, assemble as parts of ribosomes. And there's RNA that's used as a message that goes from the DNA in the nucleus to the ribosomes in the cytoplasm. What is the nucleus in the cytoplasm? If you think of a fried egg, and you think of the yellow in the fried egg, that's a good metaphor for the nucleus. And you can think about the white in the fried egg, that's a good metaphor for the cytoplasm. And if you can think of the crunchy little stuff at the very edge of the fried egg, you can think of that as the cytoplasmic membrane. Okay, so there's a kind of a metaphor to get in your mind. Now, you can think of, remember I said DNA makes RNA, RNA makes protein. Okay? So you can think of the DNA as analogous to your hard drive. It's got programs in there, only instead of zeros and ones as the code base, instead of binary, it's a 4-base code, ATGC. And it has 2 strands, and it produces the best metaphor I can come up with in the computer space, since this is Silicon Valley. Remember punch cards? I do, because I trained in the early 80s, okay? So mRNA is like a punch card. It's a physical coded entity that is read sequentially. Okay, so it's a physical thing. It's not a continuous bit stream. It's a physical thing like a punch card. And it's produced from the program that sits on the hard drive in the metaphor, your DNA and your nucleus. And you can think of it as a punch card that's transported out into the cytoplasm, into the egg bite, and it goes to a little tiny biorobot. So we're all familiar with robots, right? Industrial robots, they make all kind of cool stuff. Okay, there's little teeny tiny biorobots in our cytoplasm called ribosomes, and they make proteins. Okay, but they have to have controlling information. They have to have a punch card. They read that punch card, and based on what's in that punch card, they make a protein. They add different amino acids sequentially, okay? So that's how this works, okay? Is the ribosome sits in the cytoplasm, it reads the punch card, that's the mRNA, so that's why mRNA vaccines. Now here's the other part of the metaphor, the best I can come up with, is mRNA vaccines are the hacker that inserts a new punch card into the stack that gets those biorobots to make something they wouldn't otherwise make. And the thing that they make is the actual vaccine product. It's the protein, it's the spike in the case of all of these. Now here's this, I'm going to expand on this metaphor a little bit. An mRNA vaccine is like the hacker that inserts a new punch card into the stack to make spike instead of the other things that the ribosome would make. In the case of an adenovirus vectored vaccine, that's a DNA virus. And you take the gene for spike, you put it into this DNA virus, it infects the cells. So this is J&J here in the States, also Sanofi in Europe. Okay. You insert the spike gene into the DNA virus, it's a cold virus, it infects cells, and it goes to the nucleus. It doesn't integrate into the chromosome, it stays outside, so it's like an accessory hard drive. And it makes punch cards, it makes the mRNA that goes and controls the biorobots. So it's a little bit different of a process, but it's the same basic idea. You have a system wherein you are causing the little biorobots in your cytoplasm to manufacture the vaccine. So the vaccine manufacturing factory is your cells. And we are using gene transfer polynucleotide delivery technology to put a new code into your cells to make them make the vaccine. Does that make sense? Everybody get that? Cool. Okay, you're all officially molecular virologists now. And in the case of mRNA vaccine, the question is how do you get the RNA into the cytoplasm? Now the cool thing about RNA as opposed to DNA vaccines is if you use a DNA vaccine, it's got to go through two membranes. It's got to get into the egg white, and then it's got to get all the way into the yolk. Okay, so it's got to cross two membranes. That's really inefficient. One of the major problems with DNA as a molecule for doing this kind of genetic vaccination. RNA has just got to barely get into the cytoplasm, get loaded on a ribosome, and you're good to go. Okay, so that's a key thing. The other key thing about RNA for vaccines, RNA doesn't hang around very long. It's a short-lived molecule, and it gets broken up. So the core idea back in the 80s when I had that aha moment was that we could use mRNA as a drug because we could dose it transiently as opposed to classical gene therapy, which has the complication that if you put the gene into somebody and it turns out to have a toxicity, it's really hard to fix it. You can't like go in and cut out all the cells. Okay? So with RNA, you put the RNA in, it gets degraded after a few hours in theory, and it's gone. So if there's a toxicity, it gets washed out of the system. You just don't redose. It also fits, totally works for pharmaceutical companies because they love, you guys all understand the red model, right? You're the Silicon Valley, okay? So they love the idea that you got to keep dosing this as opposed to one and done. So how do you get the RNA in? You surround it with fats. Now, how do you surround it with fats? It turns out that liposomes, classical liposome technology, where you have a bubble, is really hard to trap the RNA on the inside. And RNA is a high-value compound. It's hard to manufacture. It's very expensive. So liposome encapsulation is very inefficient. The geniuses at Syntex years ago, in the kind of mid-'80s, found out that if you could take, it was actually a fascinating story. The way I heard the story was, he was an undergrad from UC Davis doing a rotation that said, oh, these are positively charged fats and those are negatively charged polynucleotides. What happens when you put them together? That's the way I heard the story long ago. But so it goes. RNA is a great big long string of negative charge. And if you take positively charged fats, they will spontaneously assemble and coat the RNA. And they don't actually form liposomes, they form these big aggregates, like it's displayed here in this illustration, which is inaccurate. But these liposomes, essentially, these lipids coat the RNA, and they form these large aggregates. Yes, there is polyethylene glycol on the surface. The PEG is used, some people are sensitive about the PEG issue. And yes, there is some toxicity associated with the PEG. The PEG is there to stabilize the product in the vial, because these things otherwise will self-assemble into very, very large aggregates and they won't work anymore. So the PEG is just there to stabilize it in the vial. It has a very short, if there's any chemist, acyl side chain that causes it to fall off shortly after it's injected. So that's what that's for. And these fats have fusogenic capabilities with cell membranes, and you assemble these particles so they have a net positive charge, and they self-aggregate with cell membranes when they, which generally have a negative surface charge, and they have a fusogenic component. And if we go to the next slide, so there's debate as to whether or not they're taken up through endosomes. This is a cellular process of acquiring a particle that's sticking to the surface, or do they fuse directly? This is actually from Acuitas, from Peter Cullis's lab. Peter Cullis at the University of British Columbia is actually the person that came up with the true technology advance that's enabled all these mRNA vaccines that we currently face. Okay, so what they came up with, if you go to the prior slide. Okay, so previously, so these are chemical structures. This is inside baseball. These are the lipids that are actually responsible for condensing the polynucleotide and enabling this delivery phenomena. So these are structures of fats, and you'll notice that they have that tertiary mean for any chemists. Okay, so this was the big breakthrough, is ionizable lipids that are pH sensitive, so they're positive at low pH, and then they lose that positive charge. Before, we were working with quaternary amines that are always locked into a positive state, back when I was doing it. And that's what was done at Syntex. So these are the two lipids. The one on the top is used by, let's see, the top one is used by BioNTech and by CureVac, and the bottom one is the lipid that's used by Moderna. They're very similar, they're both tertiary amines. So there's walking you through the core technology of what is an RNA vaccine, how does it get in, and what's the difference between that and an adenoviral vector vaccine, which is based on a cold virus and is a DNA vaccine, but they're both basically gene transfer, and they're using your cells as the manufacturing. Next slide. Yeah, that's Acuitas' picture. I still don't, I think that's the problem when you get, I've been trained in cell biology, I'm still not sure what this image is supposed to show. Next slide. Okay, so how did this come about? Is the next question that everybody always wants to know, and this relates to what are your bona fides, and why are you, Dr. Malone, saying that you're the initial inventor of this platform technology? So this question comes up all the time. This all happened in the late 80s, between about 87 and 89, at the Salk Institute and a startup called Vical across the street from Torrey Pines Road, across from the Salk, and at UC San Diego campus. So these are all close physical proximity, these three facilities. The key event was actually this paper by Dan St. Louis. Dan was a postdoc mentoring me as a graduate student in the laboratory of Inder Verma in the molecular biology and virology laboratories at the Salk Institute. When I was there, there was about a half a dozen Nobel laureates, including Francis Crick. And it was a hothouse for ideas. It's basically a high-end academic think tank that does wet lab research, founded by Jonas Salk and funded by the March of Dimes, sitting on the cliffs in La Jolla. Dan was working in Inder's lab on an alternative approach to gene therapy that involved retroviral vectors. And he was using these to put genes into cells and then take those cells and transplant them back into mice and see how long the protein would be expressed after doing this process. So this is early in the days of gene therapy. And Dan ran into a problem. And for me, I was a young graduate student, halfway trained MD, who thought that gene therapy was going to be my life. I was all in on gene therapy. I was sure there was going to be a gene therapist in every hospital at the time. Dan ran into a problem. The gene expression stopped after about 2 weeks after he did the transplantation, and there was a lot of consternation about how and why that happened, and a lot of explanations about gene silencing, etc. And I dug into my medical text, being the young, wet behind the ears, halfway trained MD, and I said, oh, no, this is an immune response. And this was Harrison. that now it's widely understood. Everybody agrees this is a major problem with gene therapy. At the time, it was absolute heresy to be raising this issue in a gene therapy lab, but that turned out to be what the problem was. And this caused, for me, major cognitive dissonance. What was I going to do with my life? This system imagined by Ted Friedman wasn't going to work. We weren't going to be able to correct inborn errors in metabolism because the body's immune system doesn't care whether it's a good gene or a bad gene. It cares about whether or not it's a foreign gene or the self gene in terms of proteins. So a major paradox in the whole paradigm of gene therapy. What are you going to do about it? I'd already trained with Robert Lamb at Northwestern, a flu virologist, and with Murray Gardner and company at UC Davis, where we had been working on AIDS vaccines, and I was very aware of the vaccine space. So the insight was, well, let's make lemonade out of lemons. And rather than focusing on gene therapy, let's use gene therapy technology for vaccines. And it turns out that both, historically, just by chance, the senior postdoc in the laboratory, a guy named Dinko Valerio, left and went on to found a company called Crucell, focused on gene therapy. They used the PER-C6 cell line that you've heard about, which is the one that has the fetal tissue origin. Dinko came to me a few years later. He said, hey, you're right, we got to turn our company around and stop focusing on gene therapy, focus on vaccines. The company took off, was sold to J&J, and that's the basis for the J&J vaccine. So all this stuff actually all comes back to Ida Verden's lab. Next slide. I was focused on trying to package RNA for asking questions about retroviral packaging and how to transfect it. And a series of events happened, sequential discoveries that led to really the development of a whole system that defined the necessary structure of the RNA, the method for large-scale manufacturing, the method for delivery that I've mentioned with cationic lipids. It's highly reproducible, resulted in delivery in cells and animals, including frog embryos, and patent disclosures about use of RNA as a drug using this, and patent filing from the Salk in 1988 and 1989. I left the Salk in the middle of a huge patent fight between the Salk and UC San Diego over who was going to own this, and as a graduate student, I kind of came unglued, caught in the crossfire. But I needed a job for a few months while my wife finished her bachelor's degree, so I went to, next slide, a little tiny startup company right across the road called Vical, and brought my reagents. And within about a month and a half, we had a series of discoveries that were published in Science magazine. This on the panel on the right is actually the first study that demonstrated that both naked RNA and cationic lipid formulated RNA equally transfected mouse muscle. This led to a series of patent disclosures, 10 issued patents that basically locked down the whole field of DNA and RNA vaccines for the next 20 years. It was sold to Merck for about $9 million. I left and finished my last 2 years in medical school. And Merck and Vical aggressively kept everybody out of the field for 20 years until the patents expired. And that's a whole nother story, but it's not my fault. But that's why there's a 20-year gap in the development. Merck and Vical spent well over $1 billion, a lot of investment money, and no products were forthcoming. And the company eventually got reverse mergered. We were talking about that over dinner. Excellent. So that's the origin of all this, and a brief history of my role. Now let's get into the important stuff. Next slide. Oh, pictures. Everybody loves pictures. So this is the group at the Salk Institute. Dan St. Louis is the one with his hands stretched out. I'm the little guy on the corner there with beard still. This upper right is a picture from Vical early days, where I was asked to map out all the technology implications and the patents that we were going to file. And on the lower right, this is important. I just want to point out Dr. Raj Kumar is the one who insisted that we weren't doing the good science, and we needed to do the negative control, which I was sure was not going to work. And so because Raj insisted, we did the naked RNA in addition to the RNA with the cationic lipids, and lo and behold, that worked. And so I always want to acknowledge Raj. He eventually got run out of the company here in Silicon Valley. I think you all know how these things happen from time to time. And the last I heard, he was running a muffler shop in San Diego. Next slide. Okay, now we get into the meat and potatoes. So what is the noble lie? So what we've got here, I think perhaps some of you are familiar with the concept of the noble lie, and that's what we're dealing with. So the concept of the noble lie is defined in Wikipedia and based on the Republic, authored by Plato, is a myth or untruth, often but not invariably, of religious nature, knowingly propagated by an elite to maintain social harmony or to advance an agenda. Okay, that's the definition of a noble lie. What you have here in this excerpt, Jill kindly cut out for us, and I can't believe the date. Notice it's 1984. I'm going to read from the Federal Register of June 1st, 1984. This relates to polio vaccines, but the same logic still applies. This is how the government thinks. Okay, this is in the Federal Register. Any possible doubts, whether or not well-founded, about the safety of the vaccine cannot be allowed to exist in view of the need to assure that the vaccine will continue to be used in the maximum extent consistent with the nation's public health objectives. Accordingly, because of the importance of the vaccine and of maintaining public confidence in the immunization program that depends on it, good cause exists to issue these amendments as a final rule effective immediately. Okay? Any doubts, whether or not well-founded, about the safety of the vaccine cannot be allowed to exist. Okay? That's where we're at. And I assert that what we're experiencing is a 20th century norm in terms of public health communication applied with 21st century hammers. We have amazing integrated technology. You all have helped create that. God bless you. And it's now being used on us very effectively to reinforce this edict that was published in 1984 and existed in the public health community as a general concept before then. So don't be surprised that this is what's going on. This is a long-standing policy. It's something new. What is the noble lie? I assert it has 4 key components. So 4 components of the noble lie. Herd immunity is required to enable economic and social recovery. I mean, if you think about it, this is all very familiar to you. It's the logic that you've heard. Vaccines are the only route to achieving herd immunity. The COVID-19 vaccines are perfectly safe. The COVID-19 vaccines provide protective, durable immunity. Now, I'm going to have to rush through some things because I talked too much the first part. Next slide. This is part of the mechanism that's being used to enforce it. So the Trusted News Initiative was established as a network to prevent or allow Western nations to manage the pressure during elections of misinformation coming from hostile third countries, foreign countries. And a new director, Tim Davie, came into the BBC and decided that his thing he was going to take up last winter was turning the Trusted News Initiative to ensuring that it would maintain legitimate information about vaccinations and to eliminate harmful disinformation and myths. Now, who is partners in the Trusted News Initiative? Associated Press, Associated France Press, BBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, European Broadcasting Union, Facebook, Financial Times, First Draft, Google, YouTube, The Hindu, Microsoft, Reuters, Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, Twitter, and the Washington Post. Okay, so these guys are all acting, and the rules are that if it's not the official message coming from the WHO or from your national health authority, that will be branded as misinformation or disinformation, and it will be suppressed, and you will be deleted from those platforms, and you will not be able to speak those words on those platforms. So don't use the I word, ivermectin, because it's not officially endorsed if you want to stay on YouTube. Next slide. This is not a fantasy. It's BBC. You can look it up. Next slide, please.
Next slide.
The problem is that we have got amazing horizontal integration now. So Jim Smith is a board member of Pfizer. He's also the chairman of Thomson Reuters Foundation and former president and CEO of Thomson Reuters. Reuters is integrated into this, and if you trace virtually all the large pharmaceutical industry now, industry leadership has places on the boards of all of our major media organizations. This is not a fantasy, it's not a conspiracy theory, it's the way things are. And they're also all thoroughly, as somebody that specializes in working on the Hill with our government, they are thoroughly integrated on the Hill. To be blunt, your representatives and senators owe a large debt of gratitude to the pharmaceutical industry. And there is a revolving door between the FDA and the pharmaceutical industry. Okay? And I know the people, and the head of Biologics Consulting Group used to be head of the vaccines division at FDA. And the way this works is that you do your stint at the FDA, just like if you do your stint at the Patent and Trademark Office, and then you go hang your shingle as a patent lawyer. Well, you do your stint at the FDA 3 to 5 years, and then you go hang your shingle as a consultant, and you work for the pharmaceutical industries, and you're then able to call back your old buddies within and speak to them and get insider information and help advocate and guide them. It's just the way our government works right now. Okay, next slide. So it's all horizontally integrated in a way that's never existed before. Now, here's where it starts to get ugly recently, okay? They can take away my medical license for saying things that's branded as misinformation. Remember, the definition of misinformation or disinformation is information which is inconsistent with what the World Health Organization or the CDC is currently saying. Now, as you know, what WHO and CDC is saying today may be very different tomorrow or the day after or 3 days ago before that. Okay, so what is medical information? It's whatever they say it is, whenever they say it. Now, the new twist is that what's done is Facebook funds these pop-up fact-checking organizations, and then those pop-up fact-checking organizations basically do character assassination, not just on me, I mean, I've experienced it directly, but on physicians all over the world. Okay, so that's the new ecosystem, and then Google puts in its algorithms that those pop-up fact-checkers statements rise to the top of the ranking system. So if you Google my name, you will find there's 5 different articles from Logically that attack me directly now. All of them, Logically is run by a guy who used to be a musician, believes himself to be a philosopher, he has no scientific training, and the articles written about me are written by a young man in a hoodie who is about 25 and doesn't have an undergraduate degree, but doesn't matter because they're serving their master's agenda. Okay? Now, some of you may or may not know that I was deleted from LinkedIn, and suddenly, no warning, bang, you're gone. 15 years of professional development, and you're out of there. Fortunately, my good friend Steve Kirsch made a phone call because he happens to know somebody who is the vice president of LinkedIn, so very unusual access.
And by the way, I am now deleted on LinkedIn. I've been on LinkedIn for 20 years.
There is no justice.
I've been on LinkedIn for 20 years, and I disappeared like that on a Saturday morning.
So
After 20 years, for no reason. They didn't even tell me.
So
why I'm deleted.
Steve called up this vice president who remained nameless, and very kindly he looked into it. And by the way, the reason given officially by LinkedIn, the top reason for deleting me was that post that I showed you before about the chairman of Reuters. I posted that on LinkedIn and I said, does this look like a conflict of interest to you? That was apparently what tipped the censors over the edge, is I questioned whether there was a COI there. So this individual stepped in, and it took about a week, and it took a huge number of Twitter followers deleting their LinkedIn account. And then it hit a major newspaper in Italy. The Europeans are a little more worked up over the censorship than we are, by the way, in case you weren't following news in France. And this gentleman kindly wrote back to me. Okay, I really want to credit LinkedIn. I can't imagine any other social media platform doing this. He writes back, I'd like to apologize on behalf of LinkedIn. This is key. We're just not good enough at detangling complicated, subtle feedback from microphones, subtle scientific claims, concurrent with similar but different misinformation coming from others. So he said, hey, we really don't have the level of competency to fact check somebody with 12 years of postgraduate education, and we should probably concede that point, which I thought was an amazing apology and acknowledgement. However, about 5 days ago, I was again deleted all of a sudden, without warning, because somebody in the operation at LinkedIn had read one of this character assassination pieces written logically by this young man in a hoodie, who was quite adamant that in fact I did not invent mRNA vaccines. I just invented the mRNA technology that was used to produce these vaccines, and so therefore I was lying. So that was the justification apparently for the second, and I wrote to the same vice president, and the next day, and I explained the situation, I gave them the information about this pop-up fact checker, and they turned the switch on the next day, bless their hearts. But that's where we're at, okay? I can lose my license. Peter McCullough is being attacked by Baylor. There are physicians all over the world, in Canada and the UK, even discussing early treatment is enough to have your license pulled. I've been told that in France and in Spain, physicians who talk about early treatment are deemed medically incompetent, and in some cases are threatened with institutionalization for being mentally incompetent, for talking about early treatment strategies. Okay, that's where we're at. Just get it clear. And if you think it's not going to happen here, my colleagues in Australia remind me that the troops have been called out in Sydney. Okay, so it is a slippery slope, and I don't mean to be alarmist. Next. The thing that got me involved was the bioethics, and I did this piece about bioethics, put it on Trial Site News, and I said, what's going on here is wrong. These are not licensed products. According to the Code of Federal Regulation, the common rule, here's the citation, you must have full and complete disclosure of risks for medical research, comprehension of risks, and full voluntary participation. That means no coercion and no enticement. No ice cream cones for kiddies to get them to get jabs without mom and dad's permission. No shotguns in West Virginia, or lottery tickets, or it goes on and on and on. The pressure that's being asserted on young adolescents is intense right now. It's not legal. According to federal law and the Nuremberg Code and the Helsinki Accords and the Belmont Agreement and everything else. However, the Justice Department 2 weeks ago came out with an opinion that in fact the FDA is not covered by the common rule, and they don't have to comply with these fundamentals of human clinical research ethics.
Oh my God.
Okay. Next slide. So this is where that we're at right now. So we're now up to the present. I'm going to walk you through some slides from the CDC that were leaked to the Washington Post 2 weeks ago. And based on that, I know I'm way over time.
I said Washington Times.
I'm sorry, it was Washington Times. I apologize. Thank you for reminding me. Thank heavens, my lovely wife keeps me on the straight and narrow. So Peter Navarro and I did a piece on Bannon's War Room 2 Saturdays ago, in which we laid out an alternative strategy. And I can tell you that I mentioned last week in last week's Saturday's presentation that I had a phone call from this GS-15 colleague of mine in the Department of Defense. Talked to me for about an hour and a half, gave me some messaging that I wasn't supposed to talk about certain things anymore, having to do with China and the origin of the virus. He said that we have no strategy. It is a day-to-day, they're making decisions on the fly, and it's the problem with this. So Peter and I came up with a strategy. And it turns out that that's now starting to be accepted across the world. We're going to get a clip at the very end of that. Our strategy basically comes down to this. If we continue to do universal vaccination and worldwide vaccination, what we're doing is we're training the virus to escape those vaccines. What we're doing is evolving the virus. The virus and the selective pressure for the mutant strains is coming from the vaccinated. So all this storyline that the unvaccinated are responsible is bunk. It fails basic, Darwinian evolution. It's the vaccinated that are driving the emergence of the escape mutants. And all of our immune systems are being trained to a single antigen. What that means is that, and now we know that both innate and adaptive immune systems can be trained, and we're training all of our immune systems to focus on a common antigen. And the virus, in response, is evolving to escape that selection. The prediction from Gert van den Bosch, who I used to work with at Solvay on our influenza project, a great Dutch virologist, and I'm convinced, I'm compelled by his logic, is that we're going to have escape mutants that become increasingly refined to the point where they're able to overcome any of these adaptive immune responses focused on spike. And how can that happen? Glycosylation. As you know, spike is heavily glycosylated. There's a bunch of ways that this can happen. But it seems to be happening. We're evolving viruses that are escape mutants. They will continue to converge on a common escape mutant, and then we're going to have a problem because all of our immune systems are going to be trained to a common endpoint, and that virus will overcome that common endpoint, and then it's as if there was no vaccine at all. And the other bear in the woods, by the way, is antibody-dependent enhancement. We're not going to go there, but the data coming out of Israel right now are suggesting that that may be happening also. So our strategy that we're suggesting be considered is basically the strategy of Sweden, which, by the way, the other day got to 0 deaths. So the strategy is to vaccinate the people that are highly susceptible, that are at high risk for disease. Those are the ones that need our vaccine globally. Okay, we've got to protect our elders from death, and they are highly susceptible to death. And they're probably going to need to be revaccinated every 6 months, and that is it's a great deal if you're Pfizer, but it's the current state of affairs. We're going to have to let the virus circulate in the rest of the population so that it has natural drift but not selected evolution. And we have to support that with early drug treatment. Now, Tony last week, after Peter and I came out with our piece in the Washington Times, gave a talk at a think tank in DC in which he suddenly turned around and said, hey, we're going to have to focus on making COVID like the common cold and coming up with drugs for early treatment. Unfortunately, the drugs that he focused on were antivirals and drugs in development from large pharmaceuticals that are under patent. So I'm going to walk you through carefully the next few slides that kind of show where we're at with the noble lie. Next slide. These are CDC slides if they're so marked as CDC. This is the CDC deck selected about the Delta variant. Next slide. So on this axis, we're looking at infectiousness, or R naught. Everybody's an epidemiologist now. R naught is the baseline reproductive coefficient. So an R naught of 5 means that in a baseline environment, no masks, if I'm infected, I will on average infect 5 of you. That's an R naught of 5. The Alpha variant had an R naught of about 2.5. Delta has an R naught, like chickenpox, 8. Okay? It is highly, highly infectious, and Lambda is more infectious. Fundamental principle of virology: over time, after a virus enters a new population, it tends to become more infectious and less pathogenic. That may or may not occur because we have the selective pressure of the vaccines. So, remember that. Now notice on this axis, the vertical axis is fatality scale. Notice that the CDC indicates that the Delta is about the same as the ancestral strain. This is internal leaked CDC documents. So all of the press about how Delta is so scary and it's going to kill all of us, wait till we get to those data. Next slide. Okay, I'm just going to highlight this one point. The risk of reinfection with Delta may be higher compared to Alpha, but only if your prior infection was greater than 100 days earlier. So what this is saying is the rate of reinfection. So this is saying that natural immunity protects for about 180 days, about half a year. There's other data suggesting otherwise, but this is the CDC's position, is that natural infection protects for about half a year. As is the case, just so happens, that is the durability, the lifetime of the Pfizer product is only about 6 months. Next slide. Breakthrough cases reported to national passive surveillance have a lower cycle time. A lot of you, everybody's now an expert on PCR. Okay, so lower cycles means that you've got a lot more nucleic acid, about 10 times the viral load for Delta compared to Alpha. There was an important outbreak in Barnstable County, Massachusetts, where almost all the people that were infected were previously vaccinated. So that kind of got everybody's attention. And here in the States, they showed there's no difference in mean cycle time values in vaccinated and unvaccinated cases. That means that the virus, if it infects you, if you have been vaccinated or unvaccinated, it replicates at about the same level, about 10 times higher than the Alpha variant did. And by the way, it's equally infectious, so the transmissibility, if you're infected, even if you've been vaccinated, to a third party, to your children or your elders or whatever, is the same whether or not you've been vaccinated as whether you've been unvaccinated. Next slide. May cause more severe disease than Alpha or ancestral strains. This is very limited evidence. This is CDC's deck. From what I'm seeing in the data, this is not true. Delta now increasingly is appearing to be not particularly pathogenic. Next slide. So dose effectiveness for Pfizer, you got to look at this carefully. These are different terms: confirmed infection, symptomatic disease, hospitalization. The Israeli data is often considered the best worldwide right now, and that's got an interesting backstory. But for confirmed infection and symptomatic disease or hospitalization or death, the efficacy or effectiveness, that's the field effectiveness, is about 64% for confirmed infection or systematic disease if you've been vaccinated. Hospitalization or death, it seems to be more protective against hospitalization, vaccination against Delta. Death is another issue. Next slide. So what is herd immunity? I just wanted to throw this in. This is a lovely little piece. This is two different definitions from different times, and I'm sorry about the resolution from the World Health Organization. In the first panel, the World Health Organization is defining herd immunity as the indirect protection from an infectious disease that happens when a population is immune, either through vaccination or immunity developed through previous infection. The usual way that we get through to herd immunity is through natural infection. The second definition from the CDC, from a little bit later, is that herd immunity is also known as population immunity, a concept used for vaccination that is when a population can be protected from a certain virus if a threshold of vaccination is reached. So they've now kind of set goal lines that herd immunity can only be achieved through vaccination, which we know is false. Next slide. Can herd immunity be achieved with these vaccines? This is the CDC's own data. And these are complicated graphs. These two represent, assuming that only 5% of the population has been infected, so that's natural immunity at 5%. The panels on the right assumes natural immunity of 35%, so 35% of the population has been infected and recovered. The upper line represents protection. The level here in the horizontal axis, this is different levels of vaccination coverage. So this is 100%. We've heard about everybody's got to take vaccine. That would be 70%. Remember, that was the goal for July 4th. Okay. 0.6 is about where we're at now. These are power curves about what it would take to get to 100% protection. So we would stop on the vertical axis, probability of increase. So 1 is that we continue to spread fully. 0.4 is that the probability of increase spread of Delta is only 0.4, in this case 0.5. So that's that axis. This is vaccination coverage. This is the line as if there's no masking. This is masks unvaccinated only. This assumes everybody is really good at masking and 100% compliance. Now there's a key thing here. WHO did the calculation with an R naught of 5, but they've already told us the R naught is actually 8. This is more like where we're at, but even let's assume it's here. What their data shows, even at an R naught of 5, there is no way to stop the spread of Delta. Full stop, even if we have 100% vaccine uptake. It will spread through the population. Next slide. And here's their admission. Given higher transmissibility and current vaccine coverage, universal masking is essential to reduce transmission of the Delta virus. It cannot stop it. Okay, so Delta virus will spread through our population. That's just the way things are. We don't have any choice. We have to get to drugs. Next slide. Breakthrough infections. This is, he's on the words. This is their stuff. Breakthrough infections may be as transmissible as unvaccinated cases, just what I said. More breakthrough and more community spread will happen despite vaccination, even if we had 100% vaccine uptake. Next slide. Now this is just some inside stuff having to do with latest data from Public Health England. And this is very much inside baseball. But the key thing here is if you look at those that received 2 doses versus unvaccinated, and you look at deaths within 28 days for age less than 50 and greater than or equal to 50. So these are very low numbers. This means the vaccine is protecting against death and hospitalization. Yay, okay, from Delta. But the incidence of death and hospitalization for Delta in the UK is extremely low. However, there's a glitch in the data that's rather odd, which is that although only 13 deaths from those that received 2 doses, remember most of England is vaccinated, so you got to correct for that denominator. 48 in the unvaccinated, which is the smaller subset. However, 389 deaths in greater than 50, and only 205 in greater than 50. This has been consistent in the UK data. There's something very odd going on with death.
More deaths in the vaccinated.
More deaths in the vaccinated population, those that received 2 doses. Okay? Next slide. Is this really a severe outbreak? Jill pulled these yesterday from the UK data from World Meter. And you can see in the upper panel, this is the spike of cases, new cases. They do a fairly good job of surveillance compared to us. In the lower panel is daily deaths. A lot of new cases, very little death. Yay. Next slide. So, don't hear it from me. This is a very high-profile academic thought leader. By immunizing the elderly, we've provided them with excellent protection, also contributing as widespread natural immunity. Though cases may rise, deaths will no longer follow in proportion. So there is good news here. I don't want to leave you with, just thinking that the world's going to come to an end and we're all going to die. Well, we did will, but it's, one cause or another. Some of us sooner than others. Next slide. So these are the policy options that Peter and I came up with. Next slide. Provide personal risk assessment tools. This is where Silicon Valley can really help. Okay, I know that these AI, ML-based tools are out there. Wouldn't it be lovely if we could load them on our handhelds and get a personal risk assessment and make a decision about whether or not we need vaccination? The government could say our policy is that if your risk level is above 8.5, arbitrary number, then get thee to a vaccinologist. Otherwise, we're going to support you with clear and complete data on vaccine risks and with diagnostic tools so that you're able to quickly identify whether or not you're infected. That's key. The CDC has got to step up to the plate, not to do intensive surveillance of all of us with nasal swabs, but we need to have personal diagnostic devices so that we know if we're infected and we can rapidly get early intervention with the imperfect drugs that we have. They're still quite good. COVID is complex. We need to allow docs to do what they do, practice evidence-based medicine based on laboratory testing, and stop telling them what they have to do from above. Sequence-independent, stage-appropriate medicines, what that translates to is if we go down Tony's road and we just use antivirals, we already know from HIV what we're going to get is antiviral-resistant viruses. Okay, we really need agents which are sequence-independent. The good news is the disease that kills you is your hyperinflammatory response to the virus. It's not the virus itself. Okay? And we have a good library of anti-inflammatories because the pharmaceutical industry has been developing them for decades because they make a lot of money on them. So we have many agents. Ivermectin, the data are fairly clear. I just completed a course of 3 days of ivermectin myself for my long COVID and the post-vaccination sequelae that I had after receiving Moderna × 2. I have more energy than I've had in months, and my cough stopped, and I'm sleeping through the night. I don't know, it seemed to work for me. Famotidine and celecoxib is what we're about to go into the clinic with. Fluvoxamine is another agent. Apixaban is an anticoagulant. I'm already on high-dose vitamin D. I suggest that any of you that haven't had your vitamin D levels drawn, go get them because the data are quite clear. Supplementing with vitamin D after you have the start of the disease is just too late. You got to do it now. Emphasize treating patients as soon as they develop disease. Stop censoring and blocking repurposed drug development, and think about precision, evidence-based medicine guided by laboratory test values, which is where we are at the DoD, and we've been for over a year. Next slide. I'm finally getting to the end. This is from a colleague of mine that I won't name, who actually works as a contractor for the CDC in public communication. She's an MD, PhD, MD, MPH that was trained at West Point. Public health campaigns should be positive, ethical, truthful, and empathic. People should feel empowered when making public health choices. In both actions and words, it's important to steer clear of fear, coercion, and questionable ethics for the present, but arguably mostly for the future. We're destroying public faith in our public health enterprise. Obey the law, ergo the common rule, and be transparent about risks as well as benefits. Don't circumvent time-tested processes and ethics. Trust, educate, and respect citizens' right to choose. Avoid authoritarian demands, information censorship, and psychological manipulation via big media and tech. Okay? Now, I got one more little clip, and this falls into the category of don't just believe me, believe the most senior vaccinologist in the entire UK. You can cue up that clip. Once again, most of this isn't my ideas. I've synthesized a bunch of them. But I'm getting a constant information feed now from all over the world, from top virologists and physicians who find it. I've been given a microphone in part thanks to Steve and Brett and others, and I'm grateful to share that here and participate with your community. But at this point, in many ways, I'm a channel. I've been given this platform and this ability to speak for my colleagues. So this is the head of the Oxford Vaccines Group. He is the most senior vaccinologist in all of the UK. Go ahead and roll it.
I think we are in a situation here with this current variant where herd immunity is not a possibility because it still infects vaccinated individuals. And I suspect that what the virus will throw up next is a variant which is perhaps even better at transmitting in vaccinated populations. And so that's even more of a reason not to be making a vaccine program around herd immunity. I don't think there's anything the UK can do to stop the emergence of new variants. They're going to happen. And if anything, we need to focus now not on what might stop new variants, because I don't think we have any facility to control that. We need to focus on thinking about how do we prevent people dying or going to hospital. And I think this is an enormously important thing to be thinking about today because during the course of this week, there'll be about 65,000 deaths in the world. We have now over 4 billion doses deployed of the vaccines globally. And that is now enough doses to have prevented almost all of those deaths. And yet they are continuing. So when you think about what the UK strategy should be around variants, I don't think there's anything that we can do, but what we can do is play a more active role in the global imperative, which is to stop people dying. And that means the making sure doses are going to the right people.
Okay, so don't take my mic. Is my mic live again? Nope.
I think your battery.
Okay. Yeah, because I'm so long-winded. I warned you.
So the point is, the strategy that Peter Navarro and I rolled out is now endorsed by the senior vaccinologist for the UK. We're now in that position. We have to use drugs. We have to get them on board people early, and we have to target the vaccines to the people that are most susceptible. And how long is this going to take before our government gets aligned with the new reality that's being seen by the UK government and by the government in Israel? I don't know the answer, but I have to believe that it will happen. Peter and I are doing what we can, and with your assistance, hopefully we can help our representatives and our senators and perhaps even our executive branch to see that it's time for them to come up with a strategy and a set of tactics that are aligned with the new reality. And I thank you so much for listening to my long-winded presentation and sticking with us through all the challenges.
Dr. Malone, thank you so much. I think what we just heard is, it's hard to digest, isn't it? It's just hard to imagine, not just the science, but the repression and the complications and I guess just ugliness that's going on. And so we really appreciate that you're willing to speak out, you're willing to stand up, and you're willing to help save lives. So thank you so much. So here's one for you. What must have Dr. Fauci known about Wuhan, and when must he have known it?
So this was one of the things that I was warned not to talk about by my GS15 colleague for some reason. The data I've seen is that Dr. Fauci knew about the gain-of-function work, knew about the funds transfer. I believe some of the capital that went to the Wuhan Institute can be traced back to my colleagues at Defense Threat Reduction Agency. These are called dual-purpose studies, gain-of-function research, and that's covered under the black budget. It's classified information. All I can say about this is that you may recall that President Biden said that he would get to the bottom of this quickly, and he commissioned a report from the three-letter agencies, and we have not heard a peep since then. And I think it's about 2 months. So make of that what you will. And like I said, I was told that the things that I knew to be true couldn't possibly be true about who is where, and I should stop talking about it. So that's a pretty clear indication to me that something's rotten in Denmark, but I don't know what, and I don't know what Tony knew and when he knew it. My experience, he's a pretty cagey guy, and he keeps his own counsel. So that's all I can say about Tony.
Okay.
But there was gain-of-function research going on, and to my eyes, I was assured early on, I asked the question, like in the second week in January, from a colleague who works at one of those three-letter agencies, and he said, well, my guys have all been over the sequence very carefully, and there's no evidence of genetic engineering. And which left me wondering, why were they being so careful to deny and to carefully scrutinize it at the time? So, I don't know, to me the purine cleavage site looks unusual. And it doesn't, the whole thing doesn't add up somehow. And I'm just going to leave it there.
Why would the Gates Foundation and Soros be interested in buying the COVID testing, a major COVID testing company?
Yeah, me too. At the time when the CDC is now declaring that a number of those under emergency use authorization will no longer be authorized. These coincidences keep piling up. That's all I can say. I've been trained as a expert witness, and one of the key trainings is don't try to imagine that you understand what's going on in the mind of the other person. So I don't know what's going on. I don't know what they're thinking, but it is curiouser and curiouser.
Okay. So, by the way, on your chairs is a handout from flccc.net that has treatment protocols, prevention protocols, long-haul protocols, and that may save someone's life. So I just want to make sure I say
There's
that out
some
loud.
fascinating data coming out that's partially driven by the FLCC. I think some of the top data about long hauler syndrome, and I have a personal interest in that because I'm a sufferer. I got infected, so just another part of my history. I got infected during the Biogen outbreak in late February in Boston, and I did develop long COVID. Yeah, a year and a half ago. So I've been with this all the way through. My body will never be the same. I have my last oxygen sats on the room air was 95%. That's way low from what it should be at rest. So the long haul is a real problem, chronic COVID. And there's some fascinating data about spike protein accumulating in an atypical macrophage monocyte population that is highly persistent, like 6 months or more, and it's associated both with the post-vaccination syndrome and the long haul syndrome. So that's what I can say about that. And the FLCCC, I think, is doing the best work. They don't have the big budget that the NIH does, but they have the trust of their patients.
Are there any documented cases of getting COVID-19 outside, being, has the virus been documented to be transmitted outside?
What do you mean? Oh, you're
Like
talking
out in the
about
sun?
out in the general environment.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that. I do have a friend who is a privatologist and one of the top aerosol exposure experts in the United States. He's DoD trained. He works at Tulane. He did some of the early transmissibility and infectivity studies. And I was contacted really early on, like about March, from a Boeing executive wanting to know what those data were. And what he disclosed to me was this is highly infectious, even through small particles in general aerosol or air transmission between the non-human primates in his studies. So I think that would be a controlled experiment that demonstrates transmission. Viruses are insidious things. For instance, there is no vaccine that can't be overcome by a sufficient dose of virus. It's all about what is the dose, what is the amount that's being shed or coughed or whatever by the donor, and the proximity and the environment of the recipient. It's really complex. And so I think one of the core rules in this and all of biology is never say never. However, the logic that these masks can protect against aerosol transmission is clearly false. And they may provide some, if you noticed on those graphs from the CDC, they were saying 20%, maybe 30%. That's with N95s. If they're properly worn, maybe 40%, but absolutely not 100%. Have I answered your question, whoever asked that? I hope so.
Could you, since you mentioned N95, would you mind clarifying what an N95 has to have in terms of protocol to be effective versus the masks we're seeing in
Yeah,
the
it has
room
to
tonight?
fully seal on your face and block all transmission, and it has to have a filtration size, which is what the N95 particle size defines. It will block the passage of particles of a certain size, and they can't escape around the edge of the gaskets and things
And what
like
is the
this.
particle size of the masks that the city council and the supervisors would like
I
us to
have
wear?
no idea, but it's I mean, there's some lovely experiments where people just take, I mean, you can see it, if you know anybody that vapes, get them to inhale, put a mask on, and then exhale. And you're gonna see the aerosol from the vape just come all over outside of your mask. It's really not particularly, so frankly, this is security theater, if you know that term.
Yeah, this is truly masquerade, in my opinion.
It's security theater, and we can go deeper in that. You know, people like to talk about, those that think about these things. I try to stay based on data, but this is a demonstration of your willingness to be compliant with the government mandate. I had a fascinating conversation with an Israeli scientist the other day. She sits on Steve's board, by the way, and she was telling me about the situation in Israel and correcting my misconceptions. She said that one of the reasons why Pfizer chose Israel for the initial rollout, and they did a sweetheart deal with Benjamin Netanyahu to allow them to have the vaccine, that's another story, is that the population is so compliant. Because this scientist was sharing that she, in her short time in Israel for 5 years or something, has been through 3 wars. And if the government says, get in a bunker, they get in a bunker, because there's a good chance that something's going to happen. So it's a very compliant population. They're very willing to do whatever the government tells them to do. And that's part of why they were chosen for the initial rollout. Is that how you want to live your life? I think that's a valid question, and we've seen the apparatus now that's being deployed to ensure that we will comport with the government's mandates, whether or not they are based in science and data. Have I addressed that?
Yeah. So I think this is a fair question. Why did you choose to get vaccinated?
I always get this. It started to get a little aggravating because it's like asking personal health information, but I have to say it anyhow because it's like, okay, so I had long COVID. And Jill and I have to travel internationally. I mean, I'm off to speak in Rome at the Senate in a month on drugs for COVID, international COVID conference. So we traveled internationally. There was rumors that vaccination would be effective in treating long COVID. Also, I've been worried as a vaccinologist since the outset about antibody-dependent enhancement. You can look at my LinkedIn blog, goes back to January 4th on this of 2020. I've been worried about antibody-dependent enhancement. It's the history of all prior coronavirus vaccines. And I convinced myself that the risk of ADE was low enough. We need to travel, and there was rumors that this could be effective for long COVID, and some people in the long COVID community were saying this is the case. This is still being pushed, by the way. So I took Moderna ×2. I developed grade 3 hypertension, restless leg syndrome, and a chronic cough that it got worse and worse and has only been resolved by my 3 days of ivermectin treatment, which just completed a day and a half ago. So it's a decision I made for those personal reasons. I thought it was unlikely that there would be antibody-dependent enhancement. I thought it was reasonably likely it would help with my long COVID, and we needed to travel internationally. Have I addressed that?
Thank you. Yeah. So there are people who think this was all planned. They call it the plandemic and all of that stuff. And so a related question out of that is...
I'm not going to talk about the World Economic Forum.
No, but people are wondering, Dr. Malone, why we're connected with the WHO? What's driving our connection? Why do we keep respecting them?
Historically, we set up the WHO, and it was partially an intelligence operation. It gives us access to all kinds of information, and it's another vehicle of us controlling and exerting our national influence on the world stage through the UN. That's the honest truth. Okay, I deal with these guys. This is how the world is. Why do we continue to have a relationship? A number of reasons. I mean, the World Health Organization can be useful to us. It has become much more dependent on the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It is, I can tell you, examples New Link being directly approached to subsidize the World Health Organization as part of their vaccine development program, because that's what all the other large pharma do. I mean, it is a corrupt situation, that's the truth of it. And we do derive benefit, I guess, it's not my circle, in terms of national policy and diplomacy. We derive benefit from having it exist. If it didn't exist, we would have to recreate something like it, because there does need to be global coordination. And what happens if there's a power vacuum like happened under the last administration where we stepped out? Well, who stepped in? WHO didn't stop acting. They just got more money from Bill and Melinda Gates and more money from the CCP. So you can't leave a power vacuum. This is real politics. And I think that is where this is coming from. The World Health Organization is a branch of the UN, and it is a forum for global health, real politics being exerted. And it's complex, and yes, it's corrupt, and it is what it is. Does it need to be scrubbed and rebuilt? Yeah, but how many other things also need at the same time?
So one of the fears is that there's going to be fertility problems from the vaccination. Do you want to address that?
So the fertility. And there was just a paper out in the British Medical Journal that recapitulated the stuff that I've been saying and Byron Bridle had been saying, and that we put into Trial Site News, and it's right out there in a peer-reviewed review in BMJ. Yes, the Pfizer data shows that the lipid component, the novel lipid component in the Pfizer vaccine accumulates in the ovaries to about 17%, as well as many other tissues. Is that influencing ovarian behavior? Unknown. We haven't done the FDA and the other world regulatory agencies basically gave Pfizer a pass. And part of that, it seems to be contractual. There were terms and conditions put in place that basically allowed Pfizer to have its way with various World Health Organizations and agencies. But the studies weren't done. I don't know if they have been done subsequently. There's a new package sitting in front of Peter Marks at the FDA right now. And I don't know, but there's clearly a huge push to get that licensed by end of September. In addition to this lipid accumulation in ovaries, which is a potential concern, but unknown risk that hasn't been well evaluated, there's the repeated observation by women all over the world that have accepted vaccine that they are having menometrorrhagia and dysmenorrhea, so alterations of their periods. And then there is this very odd signal that keeps, these alterations in menses that women are reporting are often gaslighted. I don't know how else to say it. That this is female hysteria. And when I hear that, I just feel like it's so 1950s.
When I feel that, I feel like getting some female hysteria.
Yeah. So that's it's just too consistent in being reported. Also reported are these odd, women in small groups will tend to become harmonized in their cycles, and yet there are these reports of women in groups where a subset are vaccinated and other women in that group also have disrupted menstruation. That's really hard to make sense out of, and one hypothesis is that may be due to exosome-mediated transmission of spike. That seems far-fetched. There's no data to support that, but I'm loath to discount the reports of women. I kind of feel like women understand their bodies, and if they're saying these things are happening, there's probably a pretty good chance they are, whether or not we've measured them. The other reproductive thing, the flat-out truth is the FDA and others did not apply the gene therapy checklist. They applied the vaccine checklist when they went through the approvals. And the vaccine checklist typically doesn't involve reproductive toxicology. The gene therapy checklist does. So they gave them a pass and they didn't ask them to do the repro-tox. That's highly questionable. And there is some ghost in the data from one study in particular that suggests that there may be increased rates of spontaneous AB in first and second trimester women that have been exposed to vaccine. That's unconfirmed, and the reason, the problem there is that there's a high spontaneous abortion rate in the first and second trimester anyhow, and so then it's a question of ratios. And what are the controls? I'm told there's a very large female reproductive toxicology study in humans, pregnancy study ongoing in the Midwest right now, but these statements that the vaccine is safe for use in pregnancy, I don't see data that support that statement. How's that?
Thank you. Okay. There is a Novavax vaccine on the horizon. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, and I had encouraged, particularly those who were vaccine hesitant. By the way, do you know that there's a study out that that looked at the level of information in vaccine hesitant individuals as opposed to vaccinated individuals? And it demonstrates that those that are currently vaccine hesitant in general are much higher informed than the general population. Okay, so this logic that we're the unwashed and deplorables
we're used to that, right?
that don't have education, that doesn't stand up to the facts. But getting back on point, I got sidetracked.
Novavax.
Oh, Novavax. So this has been a huge disappointment for me. I know the Novavax leadership. At a prior company, I was a consultant to them. I have no COI with Novavax. I probably wouldn't want to consult for them again, having been through it once. So not my favorite people, but I had really hoped that the Novavax product, which is a more traditional vaccine, would come available this summer. And I'd said so in podcasts and online. I first heard from my colleague, the GS15, that the Novavax safety signal was bad, not encouraging, and that the adjuvant that they're using is too inflammatory. So there's too much reactogenicity from the saponin adjuvant, that's a novel adjuvant that they're using, and that it's probably not going to get EUA in the near term. And then 2 reports came out, I think one in the New York Times within like 2 days that confirmed that. So unfortunately, yes, Novavax is a more traditional, it's produced in caterpillar cells. So they talk about moth cells. Yes, it's a moth that produces those cells. It's Spodoptera frugipera. And it's a insect virus that's used to produce the protein. And the protein is produced as small kind of particulate matter. But it doesn't cause your cells to be the manufacturing. And you know precisely how much antigen spike is injected into you with the Novavax product, but unfortunately it appears that the adjuvant is too inflammatory and is causing people too much acute reactogenicity, and they're going to have to reformulate it and run additional trials. And I'm sorry to report that right now we don't have any alternatives coming out of the States in the pipeline for more traditional vaccines that I'm aware of. I do know of a number of them in development offshore that may come onshore, but it's not going to be this soon.
Could you talk about the concept of design to fail in the trials?
Oh boy. Okay, so so it's easy to, as a clinical trialist, the devil is in the details, and it's very easy to, particularly if one has a relatively lax regulatory oversight, it's very easy to manipulate the outcome on clinical trials by selecting the population that you're going to be testing and by selecting the endpoints and when you sample those endpoints. Just to give an example, in some of the phase 1 trials, they bled the subjects at day 14 and day 28 or 21. Now, the reason why you do that, in addition to day 0, is that at day 14, if you get a strong immune response, that's a sign of a recall response, that you already had memory cells. And we already knew from some of the early data that all of us have background reactogenicity against the circulating beta coronaviruses. And a lot of that immune response will score in certain assays as neutralizing antibodies. So there's an example. So what was done in subsequent phase 2 and phase 3 tests is they drop the 14-day bleed, so you can't see which fraction of patients are actually being boosted as opposed to the ones that are getting a primary immune response. There's one example. Another example of manipulating a trial is if you knew, let's just imagine a thought experiment, that you knew that one of the biggest risks in developing a coronavirus vaccine is antibody-dependent enhancement. And antibody-dependent enhancement is most likely to show up during the waning phase of the immune response. It's just fundamental vaccinology, okay, dengue and everything else. My esteemed colleague has nodded, so he concurs that I'm not crazy. So the waning phase, which means, by the way, after 6 months, now we know, is when the greatest risk is of antibody-dependent enhancement occurring, because it's a phase that has a long, slow taper in which you don't have enough antibodies, typically functional antibodies, in your blood to fully block the infectivity of the virus, but you have enough to bind it and to enable it to infect cells that it might not otherwise infect, okay? So that's how that works. If you got that, you're a genius, because that was kind of hard mental flip-flops you had to just make. So antibody-dependent enhancement happens in the waning phase. So if you knew that this was the greatest risk, you would design a phase 3 study or a phase 2 study even that would follow patients for at least 6 months or more after vaccination so you could pick up antibody-dependent enhancement. And they didn't do it. They didn't do it intentionally, and the FDA told them in the Pfizer, for instance, letter authorizing emergency use authorization that they can't evaluate the risk of antibody-dependent enhancement because the clinical trials don't support it. And the FDA gently said, basically, well, we think you ought to do it if you feel like it, and we're not going to tell you you have to do it. Normally, if I was setting up, advancing a vaccine, at that stage the FDA would have said, you're darn well going to do ADE studies. But for some reason they gave Pfizer a pass, and they said, well, we think you ought to do it. We think it's a big risk, but we're not going to tell you you have to do it. So there's another example of designing a trial in that way. Now, there's discussions about whether or not the hydroxychloroquine trials done by the World Health Organization were designed to fail by dosing at a level of hydroxychloroquine known to be toxic. And in fact, that's what happened. And there's discussion about my good friend Sina Bavari involved in that advocacy for that level of dosing, and a former DoD colleague. So there's another example of design to fail. Another one can be if you dose the drug at too low a level. And so you might run a study with ivermectin, and you might run that study at, say, 100 micrograms per kilogram, which we know is unlikely to be an effective dose, and you might run it with only 2 doses, say on day 1 and 3, and then at the end of your trial you might conclude ivermectin doesn't work because we showed it, we did a double-blind randomized clinical trial. So it's really important that you design the trial to succeed based on science, based on solid science. And this is why generally with all these things we go phase 1 dose escalation, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 2 is designed so that you can power the phase 3 and make sure you know what the endpoints are, etc. We have this standard progression of what we have to do in evaluating any vaccine or any drug candidate. And we basically agreed under Operation Warp Speed, we're going to bypass all that stuff and just rush right to the endpoint. And kind of now we're paying the price. Have I answered your question?
You have. Do you have the energy to answer a few more? I have a beautiful blizzard of questions.
I can go on and on, but you guys are going to fall asleep. I had a double espresso with sugar before I came here, so I'm still going.
We really appreciate it. We always have a lot of questions tonight. We have so many, and it doesn't surprise me because we have such an interesting and informed audience. So we'll keep going for just a little bit more if you can do it. Dr. Malone and Dr. Malone are from the East Coast, so they're staying up late with us, which is pretty nice. Okay, so we're going to do a little poll in the room. How many of you are connected to medicine in some way? Yeah.
Pretty formidable.
Yeah. One of the most powerful groups in expressing concern about this has been the nurses.
Yes.
And now the nurses are being pressured to be vaccinated. And they're reporting seeing some pretty strange stuff. including, according to them, there's things that should be reported that aren't being reported. So what would you say to the medical community and the rest of Silicon Valley who's being pressured to be vaccinated? What could you offer some thoughts on that?
What I mostly can say is empathy. My heart goes out to you. This, in my opinion, is an untenable situation. It's the enforcement of vaccine mandates for an unlicensed drug is not legal to my eye. And they're going to try to, I'm pretty sure they know that's the case, which is why the Justice Department made that pronouncement and why they're trying to rush to licensure so that they can overcome that problem. I'm doing everything I can to try to bend consensus towards what Peter and I had rolled out. I hear of mass action by nurses. I hear of some hospitals basically saying, don't let the door hit you on the way out, and we'll just hire more. How demoralizing is that? Nurses are the backbone of our response. I don't know how to advise you. I get calls all the time about nurses in particular, and also now military personnel that are frantic. So I get nurses, military personnel, and young adults going back to university. Those are calls I get, or their parents. Jill's now fielding them. They come at us all the time, and the best I have to offer in most cases, I can't write a medical exemption, and I can just offer empathy. I don't know what to say. The damage we're doing to public trust in the public health system is profound. And for what, let me share something else. I put up, about a month and a half ago on LinkedIn, I posted something and I said, what's going to happen to public trust in the public health system if it turns out that ivermectin is safe and has efficacy, and the vaccines are not perfectly safe? At the time, that was pretty edgy to put that out. Now, it's kind of like we all agree that that's the case, and the other leg to that stool that I didn't say, and the lab leak hypothesis is demonstrated to have merit. And what I got back, it went viral, and I got back hundreds and hundreds of comments basically saying we've already lost faith in the public health system. What a price to pay for the noble lie. I don't know what's on the other side of the tunnel.
How many of you know somebody who has died of COVID? How many of you know somebody who has died from the vaccine? Dr. Malone, how do we protect the children?
So that has been my priority, is that and I belong to this a Puna coalition in Big Island that's been set up. They're trying really hard to convince their government and also to support university presidents. University presidents right now are under enormous pressure to mandate forced vaccination of incoming students. Steve has been at the forefront of trying to convince some of your local university leadership at Stanford University. That has generally been non-receptive to that message.
It's like talking to a wall.
Yeah, a wall with preconceived notions. This is what I know, and this is the message. Are we still recording?
Yes.
Oh. I'm not allowed to say this. I did have a conversation with a senior member of Democratic political leadership, and I pointed out that somebody that you may know might even have a local district. And I pointed out that the ability to maintain the House is going to be dependent on three particular political cohorts: suburban women, young adults, and African Americans. African Americans currently accept vaccine about 20%. They are highly wary of the CDC. There's this thing, called Tuskegee, and they really don't like the public health record in the United States. And suburban moms, in my experience, are kind of a little bit pissed off, particularly about their children having to go back, the ones that are having to go back, they're young adults, to the university and have mandated vaccines, and their adolescents. I hear from pediatric cardiologists the incidence rate of the cardiomyopathy is much higher than being reported in bears. And this gets back to the nurses. The frontline docs, cardiologists, and nurses are pretty much all saying, this is way worse than we're being told. And already, there was just today, I think it was this morning, from CDC and MWR, saying that there had been a big group convened and they had all decided that the risk-benefit ratios still favored vaccination of adolescents and young adults. They didn't share what the numbers were for that risk-benefit ratio. To my eyes and those of many others, including the statisticians that Steve has hired to look at the data, and I've seen similar analyses being done up in Canada based on Medicare, Medicaid databases. There's evidence that these adverse events are grossly underreported, and the risk-benefit ratio for infants through in even low 30s is upside down. And that's the risks that we know, not the adverse events like autoimmunity that we don't have knowledge about yet, or the other ones that are emerging.
Dr. Malone, speaking of autoimmunity, could I insert a question there, because there's a lot of questions about some personal health situations. If somebody already has an autoimmune problem.
Oh, this is the hard one.
Oh.
I just don't know how to answer this. If you're asking if someone already has the pre-existing condition,
yeah. How do they make that decision?
Inflammatory, how do they make a decision? I don't know. I don't know how to advise you on that. That is the hardest of the hard questions I get. Is I'm 45, otherwise healthy, and I have a significant inflammatory or autoimmune condition, and should I take vaccine or not take vaccine? And that cuts both ways, because you're at a higher risk potentially for the disease, and yet you're at a higher risk potentially for the adverse event from the vaccine. And there's no right answer. And all I can give to those people is, speak with your rheumatologist, speak with your physician that you work with, that you can trust, get informed about the data, and then it's kind of a roll the dice. And what you can do is, if you use one of the RNA vaccines, and Pfizer is about 1/3 of the dose of Moderna. That's another story. How come Moderna is so high? So if you were to take Pfizer and carefully monitor for your adverse events after dose 1 is a pretty good predictor of dose 2. Only dose 2 generally is higher and broader in your adverse event profile. So that's the best I can give to those people, is if you do decide to go forward, you might want to think about starting with Pfizer, do 1 dose, you might want to take anti-inflammatories at the same time. There is a good case to be made to drawing bloods for D-dimer before you get vaccinated and after you get vaccinated. About 60% of people receiving vaccine will show elevated D-dimers, which is the marker for microcoagulopathy. That is a problem with the virus also.
That's the clotting problem that we're hearing about.
Yeah, and so pre and post D-dimer, trial vaccine, dose 1, and watch. And if you get it, if you're getting the adverse events, after dose 2, you're much more likely to have more adverse events. But there's no good answer here, because if you're only partially vaccinated, that makes it so that you're going to be at higher risk, because the durability is going to be shorter, and you'll be potentially, if ADE is actually developing, and watch the Israeli data closely, then you'd be potentially at higher risk for ADE developing sooner. So there's just no way out of the box, other than if we had good therapeutic agents administered early in infection. And that's kind of your only other option.
Okay, so I'm going to offer you a few more, and then Dr. Malone is offered to visit briefly after our program. So if I didn't get to your question, please understand it's because we have so many and they're all so good, and I thank you for your engagement tonight. I'm old enough, many of you are old enough to remember this question, did the rabbit die? Do you remember that?
Yeah.
That was about whether you were pregnant or not.
Ah.
Right? Yeah. So there's a question, did the ferrets really die? In other words, we've been told that the animals didn't survive the testing of this vaccine. Is that true?
I have not heard that. What I've heard is that I don't know about the ferret studies. I know about the non-human primate studies a little bit from Chad Roy. I know NHPs are really hard to give disease to. I don't know the nuances of a particular ferret study and whether they died from the vaccine. Typically, one would administer a drug agent to a point of toxicity to define maximum tolerated dose. So if there was a well-designed ferret study, non-clinical, that was designed as a toxicology study, they ideally should have dosed to the point where they had a significant dose-limiting toxicity. That would be the ideal. Would you agree?
Well, it's standard to kill animals in toxicology studies. No vaccine is going to get to the market unless you kill a significant number of animals. But it's a direct result of massively overdosing the animals.
Just so. Yeah, hopefully.
So we have backup from Dr. Peter Milner here in the front row. All right, so this has been an incredibly rich program. I'm going to close with this question, Dr. Malone, from our audience member. How can we help you?
Aha, that's kind. Moral support today has been great. Thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. I really am convinced that all the science and logic in all the world isn't going to really, I can bend things a little bit. Serving, as I've been told that one of the reasons why people want to listen to me is because I'm coming across as honest, truthful, and not, and level-headed, balanced. I think sharing with your colleagues in a way that isn't confrontational information. I think that we're so dug into our foxholes, and this kind of authoritarian message is driving everybody to their foxholes. If we can get out of that and share with our peers truth as we understand it, knowing that each of us sees a different truth, that's helpful. I really think that I was once trained in conflict management.
And we need you to pick it up.
I was once trained in conflict management, and the point was made that if you come at things as a fight, you're just going to get a fight back. If you come at things with knowledge and information and compassion, then sometimes you can break through. And the metaphor of the red pill, that's what I'm finding is the bioethics argument, the children, things like this are often a point that you can overcome people's mental resistance to hearing messaging that's different from the dominant narrative. Peter and I are trying to put out a counter narrative, and I think it has a lot of merit in spreading that counter narrative so that you don't, I like the position, don't just come with a problem, come with a solution. And so this counter narrative I've tried to give you is a solution. I think it's more sound, it's more fact-based, and it's getting support by very senior people across the world. What, Jill?
I just want to say this kind of narrative is also implemented in Sweden.
Yeah, so Jill's point, if you want to see an example of the counter narrative that we're advocating in play, cite Sweden. Okay? It doesn't have to be this way. So don't fight, empathize and communicate. And I think that we may be able to bend it a little bit with logic. I think that to really put a halt, it's going to be a political issue. And I do think that sorry, the angry moms can rule the world. We know that succeed a lot of times. And they are, suburban, sorry to be stereotyped, suburban angry moms are a hugely powerful force right now because they are a swing group. And the African American cohort is not liking this. They've seen it before. And young adults that are now being subjected to that. I think that there has to be a combination of logic and giving the government, giving all these people that are so dug in their narrative, giving them a path out of the woods and not being too quick to just jump on them, when we see that they're pivoting. Right now the great pivot is in motion, and we kind of got to let it happen if we want it to happen. And these folks have got to save face. They're going to do it. Or if we continue to attack them as they're pivoting, they're just going to fall back in their foxholes. So again, I really think that a little bit of empathy here will go a long way, and trying not to fight them, but trying to help them to understand that there's another way to think. They don't, and I guess that's the last thing. I hear that again and again. Just think. Encourage people to think. Just get informed and think. Don't just, we talk about sheeple and all those stereotypes, but if as a culture we're going to get out of this and all the other problems we're facing right now, we got to start turning on our minds a little bit and getting out of just looking at our cell phones all the time. So there's my pontification. Thank you for asking.
Thank you so much.